Now, many of you may not be familiar with the story we read this morning of Moses after 40 years wandering in the wilderness, finally standing on the mountaintop, looking out over the land that he and the Israelites had been searching for, a land which they had been promised for so long. And it's a rather poignant picture. An old man catching a glimpse of the promised land, yet we are told unable to cross over into his life's goal, his life's dream. The land of milk and honey. The completion of all he had done his whole life had struggled to accomplish. Freedom and liberation. And it's an awesome image, an image that haunts us, him on that mountaintop looking out on the promised land, unable to cross over. It's beautiful, deeply, achingly sad, and an evocative promise. Now, Martin Luther King evoked the image of this story in a sermon on April 3rd, 1968, before a packed, overflowing church in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had come to that town to support a sanitation workers' strike. And he told the crowd in that sermon, "We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't really matter," he said with me now. "It doesn't really matter with me now because I have been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to that promised land." Beautiful, beautiful words, evoking that image of Moses on the mountaintop. In less than 24 hours after these prophetic words in which he saw the promised land but would not get there, Martin Luther King is assassinated. So that image of Moses on that mountain, glimpsing the promised land, yet not able to cross over, is particularly poignant, I think, for us these days, these what we hope are the last days of COVID-19, as we too, metaphorically, if you will, are standing at the edge, at the precipice, glimpsing the promised land ahead, at the end of our wandering in the wilderness of coronavirus. A wilderness that could be defined by isolation and sickness and death. Yet we are not quite there yet, are we? And I don't know about you, but I'm finding it really, really hard to be patient now, to continue the precautions, the safety measures necessary to protect myself, to protect my neighbor, those around me. We can see the promised land. We're just not there yet. And it strikes me that even as we catch glimpses of that promised land from this mountaintop, when we might get to that point in which we can gather together in person in the community with each other that feeds our souls and spirits, we struggle right now in crossing over into and beyond this wilderness of coronavirus. The amazing and extraordinary speed of the development of the vaccines is a testament to what we human beings can accomplish if we work together using the gifts of God to create prosperity and possibility for human life. It's amazing, it's a miracle if you think about it, that in less than a year and starting from scratch, we have created a life-saving tool that can return us to life together. You talk about promised land. Every evidence so far how promising this is around the world, we can see it, yet we're not quite there yet. Part of that challenge is the rollout of the vaccines themselves. They kind of serve, it struck me, as a metaphor for much of the dysfunction and disparity underlying much of our communities, our societies. It seems like a perfect metaphor, in fact, due to a lack of foresight, a lack of planning. There is, at this time, and for the foreseeable future, a shortage of vaccines, a sense of scarcity about vaccines. And this has resulted in vaccines not getting to the most vulnerable, those communities that have been more greatly affected by the disease. And while we kind of know, and while state agencies and national leadership know and have prioritized many of these groups, the reality is as far different as we all kind of scramble to get vaccinated. And it is a kind of metaphor for much of our society where we operate as if everyone should just try to get their own as opposed to ensuring the most vulnerable are helped first. We can see that promised land, that's what the promised land is, the most vulnerable helped. We just can't seem to get there. Now, I've been struck just almost every day reading news articles that have highlighted the disparities of these vaccine distributions, that many of our seniors, 65 and over, especially those who are poor and have meager means, are unable to get a shot because they do not have the access or the ability or the skills to make an online appointment. Just recently read an article that vaccines identified for certain postcode areas, identified because they were the hardest hit by the coronavirus, usually poor neighborhoods, usually communities of color. Those vaccines are being taken by others. They even have a name for it now, I heard, vaccine gentrification, where those in the suburbs jump in line in those poor areas. Now, we know the promised land is there will be a time when there's plenty of vaccines for everyone. We can see it. We're just not there yet. And that image of Moses on the mountaintop seeing the promised land, not able to cross over into its abundance, into its possibilities, that could be depressing. And it has some deep sadness to it. But I actually think it's a metaphor, an expression of something about the human condition, and also about our calling as people of God, that asserts we always stand on the mountaintop. We always, if people of faith, catch glimpses of the promised land, and we always know that we will never, ever fully get there in our lifetimes. And there's something meaningful, something incredibly faithful that in believing and working towards that promised land, always reaching over it, but knowing that we will never, ever fully cross over into its fullness. That's what it means to have faith. And so I often wonder if Martin Luther King had survived beyond 1968. I think he would be in his 90s these days. If he would come back and had lived and would see the world and would believe we had achieved the dream he pursued his whole life, yet never got to see into fruition. And I can imagine that he would say, we've gotten closer, but we're not there yet. I think he'd say, we're inching closer, but we're not there yet. There's a quote I love, an incredibly meaningful quote to ponder. And that quote is, I think it's from a gentleman named Nelson Henderson, that the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. I'll say that again, the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. I'm wondering if our task as a witness to Christ in the world is to find ways, less worried about our getting vaccines, but to find ways in which we can ensure the elderly have access, to find ways in which we can ensure that the poor have access, to find ways in which we try to plant trees that at least we may not sit under the shade yet. That the meaning of faith and the meaning of life is to live that way, to glimpse the promise, the abundance, the possibility to believe in it so wholeheartedly, even if we can't get there yet. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.